It's a joy to see you here, even though this year our heart is a little broken, and it is broken, and I don't really know what to do about it yet, and I don't know if you do either. I'm getting there. I have to warm up. The great problems of life are ones that never have simple solutions. And if there was such a clear, simple solution, it probably wouldn't be a problem. But there's a pain. Thank you. There's a pain. לא, אני חושב שהוא יותר טוב. There's a pain that many of us have been feeling for a very long time. And we'll talk about that pain a lot over the next couple of weeks. Not all the time, but it's going to be in the background a lot. Because while I don't have an answer, and I don't know if any of you do, I'm hoping that over 2 weeks, it provides for you an opportunity to think and to reflect and to articulate for yourself the voice that you want to take as you come home. Because the Jewish people are broken. Now, we've been broken for a long time. But when we have just enough anti-Semitism or just enough terror, then the brokenness becomes something that we are psychologically challenged to ignore. I know you feel your pain, but. And as a responsible person, you say, I'm going to put my pain aside, and because I know I'll deal with it tomorrow. And I think tomorrow has been coming for quite a long time. And the sad truth is that nothing has changed. The sad truth is that there really is no new news. The only new news is a feeling enough. And I love being here with you. And I love being here with you at this time. So that together we could learn. Together we could think. Together we can come up with individual responses, because that's what it's going to be. They're going to be individual responses for you as you stand up and speak about and relate Israel to your community. I love being here with you because the one thing that all of us take for granted, and there might be somebody who I just included who doesn't want to be included, so I apologize. But what I would like to think all of us share in common is that Israel is an integral part of what it means to be a Jew. Israel is not the place that you support because here there's Jews at risk. It's not another Jew at risk. It's something much deeper for you. In many ways, you are the dream of Zionism. You are exactly what Zionism yearned for. That people would feel connected to this place regardless of where they lived, would take it seriously, would fight for a place to be here, to be seen here, to be heard here. And so together, I wish us meaningful pain. Welcome to my world. Because that's what it is. We're not going to gloss over it, and there's not going to be a happy ending. But we're going to learn. And maybe that's what you rabbis do. We learn because we're responsible. As religious leaders, as rabbis, as cantors, We carry the future of Judaism. And it's our job to make sure that our people hear. And we are faced with a huge responsibility right now. Because while it's been a long time coming, divorce is possible. It is possible. Not really for any of you. Oh, you could huff and puff, but deep down, divorce is not possible. But for our community, it is. And that will change the whole meaning of what it means to be a Jew in the modern world. Judaism will fundamentally change. Now it's true that 10 Qassam rockets will quiet some of the immediate protest. And that's inevitable. And in certain environments, it will become politically incorrect to talk. But while you can't talk, the wound stays. And how many wounds will it take till, in a deep sense, we can't heal again? And it's our job to make sure that we don't get there. Now, I believe that a not insignificant influence on the contemporary reality that we're facing is a byproduct of 1967. 1967 did not just put forth the challenges of morality, of war and occupation. It also shifted the way Israelis and world Jewry understand Judaism and understand our relationship with each other. But it's not just 1967. It is an unfolding of a story which starts at the beginning of the Zionist revolution. And we're going to study a lot of that together. And what I would like to do in these introductory remarks is put forth for you, I want to focus on 67 for now, even though our conference is much larger than that, and as it should be. I want to share with you some thoughts on how 1967 basically redefined Judaism and Jewish identity. And much of what we're going to do over the next 2 weeks is to look at the ways that these ideas unfold, whether it has to do with issues of state and religion, whether it has to do with the relationship between Israel and world Jewry, or whether it has to do with the relationship between the Jewish people and the Palestinian people, between and issues of occupation. 1967 created a new trinity in Jewish life. The trinity which becomes the pillar of how we live Jewishly. And this trinity is the trinity of power, land, and God. Each one of these three were central to our conversation, central to our identity, but they were essentially redefined by 1967 in ways that shape every one of us, whether directly or indirectly. And I'd like to tell that story briefly and review that story briefly. Power, land, and God. Power. You couldn't associate in one sentence Jews and power for 2,000 years. Couldn't talk about it. You couldn't see us as people of power unless you bought into rabbinic apologetics. Rabbinic apologetics were nice. Ezu hagibor hakoveshet yitzro. Then I was Atlas. I'm Atlas. I am the one who controls my whatever it is that I can't do anyway, but my impulses. And what's nice is it's impulses. I'm not even controlling what I could do. I'm not even controlling my power because I don't have power. All I have is impulses. What a great knacker. I could control my impulses. We were great controllers of our fantasies. We knew that our fantasies couldn't be actualized. Zionism envisioned a new powerful Jew, a Jew of muscle, a Jew who could take care of themselves. But that Zionist dream was not fulfilled by the Chalutz. And that Zionist dream was not fulfilled in 1948. That Zionist dream comes to fruition in 1967. 1967 is when Israel's War of Independence is won, not in 1948. In 1948, we have an armistice agreement, but it's still precarious. We're still 200 million people surrounding 2.25 million Jews. Jewish survival still seems profoundly impossible. Before the 1967 war, a Holocaust seems to be a plausible reality. It could happen. Now, how could it happen after 48? Because in 48, we didn't change the basic equation. It was still a state put together with Scotch tape. What fundamentally changes in 67 is not the numerical balance between Israel and the nations and the Arab nations, but what changes fundamentally is the equation and balance of power. Post 67, we become the superpower of the Middle East. The enormity of the victory, the nature of the victory following the possibility of total devastation. The statement, the remarkable statement of that victory on all fronts. What is it? The tripling of our borders, or more. All creates a new experience for Jews. All of a sudden, we are people of power. Power, this experience of power, dramatically transformed the way Jews felt as Jews. I would argue that it is 1967 that makes secular Zionism a religious possibility. Because with power comes a profound sense of pride. When you are a person of power, you feel proud to belong to this group. When Jews are now Jews of power, I want to be a Jew. Not because I love Judaism, not because I'm falling in love with what the rabbis said, none of the above. I want to be part of this group. It becomes plausible to see yourself as part of this group and in so doing, create a sufficiently inspiring and enticing identity. It's very difficult to want to be connected to the pathetic people of history. Why would you want to join the pathetic people of history unless you were basically a masochist? Like, what is it? Oh, I'm part of this people. Oh, wow. For what? What is it that calls you? Jewish peoplehood was always an integral part of how we understood our Jewishness, but at the end of the day, for what? If there weren't Jewish values, Jewish ideas, Jewish principles, what was it that you were buying into? If there wasn't some messianic hope, what was the great bargain that you were getting by being God's chosen people? Choose somebody else. I don't need it. Post 67, just being part of this people is Dayenu. I'm proud. 1967 creates the possibility of an Israeli Jewish identity as a sufficiently powerful one to create every sense of national identity that you're looking for. Who would not want to be a part of this? That victory solidifies Israeliness at the heart of the Jewish people. It also solidifies for North American Jews in particular. I can't speak for Jews outside of North America because I don't know. But I imagine it's the same. That a big part of my Jewishness is because I'm connected to Israel. Not holy Israel, victorious Israel, powerful Israel. To this very day, the most invested Jewish educational program is essentially a 1967 construct. Birthright. It's a 1967 construct funded by people who were transformed themselves individually by 1967. They didn't go to synagogue. They're not synagogue members. They're not camp members. They're Jewish because of Israel. That's what made them Jewish. That's what created their pride. That's why in North America, people used to say, I belong to Federation. You don't donate to Federation. You belong to Federation. It's attractive, this people. We are the envy. It's nice being the David who defeats the Goliath. Who wouldn't want to join? And so if you could somehow come here and feel that experience, that sense of pride, then you would want to be a Jew. Because to be a Jew is to be a part of a people. But I don't have to connect to the culture, to Torah. That's not, there's a deeper, or maybe shallower, depending on your perspective, there's another avenue for feeling full Jewishly. And I come and I visit Israel. How many of you remember all the tourist shops, which all they did was sell military stuff? And if you came back from Israel, like oy vavoy if you actually brought a bullet. But like back then you were allowed. But if you could just look, I have a bullet. I know, but I remember the excitement of holding a bullet. Not to speak of having officers' stuff on the whole thing. I felt good. Sharansky speaks about how 1967 transformed Soviet Jewry. He says the minute he heard the words, the Temple Mount is in our hands, he says, I didn't know what the Temple Mount was. I never even knew that there was a temple. But I knew all of a sudden now I was a Jew. I knew all of a sudden now that there was a place that was my home. All of a sudden the anti-Semitism which surrounded me starts treating me differently. All because of the victory of 67. Being part of a winning team. Powerful team, a team that could do the impossible, creates a core feature of Jewish identity, which sustained us for about 50 years, or 40. And it's waning. And the events that we're experiencing now are just furthering its, or accelerating its challenge. But it already had started to grow thin. As life. Because this mythic figure that hops from 67 to Entebbe and back to 67 again, but somehow could skip an Intifada and a Lebanon and all, there's like stuff gets in the way. But there is so much of our educational Jewish energy is spent on sustaining the Jewishness of power. American Jewish community through 1967 vicariously not only feel proud, but they also begin to associate themselves as Jews of power and completely redefine their place in the public sphere. But like everything in life, everything is both a blessing and a challenge. I love Jewish power. I love it. As an Israeli, I love that feeling of being able to protect myself. I love the dignity that comes with victory. Love it. The only people who deride power are usually, except for a few ideologues, for most, the only people who deride power are those who've always had it. Those who know what powerlessness means. Like us, we recognize the huge bracha of 1967. The challenge we face is that the line between pride and arrogance is this thin. It's this thin. And when power produces pride, it also dances with arrogance. Jews post-1967, for the first time in 2,000 years, strut. Jews don't strut. When you're 14.5 million people in the world, you don't strut. You walk, you might knock on a door. You don't strut. Like, who are you to strut? It's like, what are you strutting for? It's like, it's this little mouse strutting somewhere. It's like, makes a big impression. But like, who are you to strut? Post-1967, when you defeat Goliath, you're Goliath. And what happens when you begin to strut? All of a sudden, as we will discuss more and more, a status quo seems to be sustainable forever. How hard do you work to look for new solutions? When power is on your side, guess what you have? Time. When you strut and belittle others, guess what you have? Time. How to be people of power and still be a people who don't let power override our Torah. How do we create a Torah of power? Is still the challenge facing the Jewish people 50 years after 1967. What does it mean to be a Jew with power? All the ramifications of that you know as well as I. And again, we will study this throughout the next 2 weeks. It also, by the way, has a direct influence on inner Israeli politics. Because power is no longer simply something that is given to the state. Individuals begin to see themselves as having power, and our whole inter-ideological, interdenominational conversations begin to change. Because when you're humble, when you're aware of the fact that God says about the boastful one, he or she and I cannot live in the same world. When your power begins to dominate and your pride begins to dominate, all of a sudden you look at other people differently. What you think, could you be an Aaron who's powerful? Could you be an Ohev Shalom and Rodef Shalom? It's an interesting question. Why wasn't Moshe Aaron? And maybe only Aaron could be Aaron. That something happens when you're, what is the term with the upper people above? I don't know. When you're hobnobbing, is that the term? Yeah. I hope it's using it correctly, and if not, fix it. When you're hobnobbing with stuff and with God, and you're doing this and that, even he's modest, but he's still not ohev shalom v'rodev shalom. And a lot of the way we talk to each other in Israeli society shifts post-67. And it always takes time, but it's getting deeper and deeper. Jews of power and what are its implications is a major issue post-67, redefines who we are and redefines our responsibilities and challenges. Land. Before 67, Jews are people of the book. Post-67, we also become people of the land. And just like pride, also land could create a sufficiently powerful and compelling Jewish identity. Before 67, not one of the holy sites of the Jewish people were in Jewish hands. And Ilana's going to speak about that when we talk about the partition plan. Yuda's going to concentrate on the whole issue of peoplehood of 1917. Ilana's going to concentrate on the issue of what are the consequences of this partition plan and Israel accepting. But we accepted a partition plan in which not one of Jewish holy sites was in our hand. Nothing. Post-67, for the first time, we are not simply in the modern land of Israel, we are now in the land of our ancestors. The land can create a Jewish identity. But again, not an identity through Torah. Because I don't have to connect to my past through what my past taught. All I have to do is walk where my past walked. Israel becomes a place which does not merely connect you to the Jewish people and give you a pride of identity. Israel, secular Israel, the land of Israel, by being the residue of holy sites, becomes the place through which you could experience God, you could experience your tradition, you could experience your past just through the physical space of this land. Through the land, I feel Jewish. And it's not just Israelis who do tiyulim, the whole phenomena of pilgrimage to Israel is that through this space, it's not just pride. Through this space, I experience something different. And the trip to Israel, which integrates, it's not a lecture, it's experiencing, it's feeling what does it mean to be in Jewish space. Creates again another dimension of what it means to be a Jew. But here too, just like power, 1967 throws it upon us, and 50 years later we still do not have a fully articulated and developed Torah of what does it mean to be people of the land, and what is the relationship between people of the land and people of the book. You cannot understand the success of Gush Emunim if you think there's some little minority who somehow succeeded to manipulate the Israeli political system to be able to achieve things far greater than their relative power in the Knesset or in society. Gush Emunim spoke to the experience of what it means to be a people of the land. And when they made people of the land, in many ways, the new Torah of Israel, secular Israel heard, because post-67, they experienced it too. And they just saw Gush Emunim not as an extreme form, but Gush Emunim as a more complete fulfillment and commitment to a Torah that they themselves experienced. Tel Aviv is a great city. Tel Aviv is the capital of Israel. Jerusalem is the capital of the Jewish people. And post-67, that experience excites Jews in Israel and around the world. And we still haven't figured it out. Because when you're people of the land, what happens when somebody else is living on your land? It is the people of the book which demands that you hear A, B, C, or D. But as people of the land, you're not even here. It's very hard even to see you. Because it's my land. And while initially a number of politicians in Israel said, oh, this is going to be too big a problem, let's forget about it, for the vast majority of Israelis, it is only in the 80s, only in the first Intifada, that we began to actually, whoa, there's actually somebody here. I know Begin signs and recognizes the rights of the Palestinian people. In 77, I don't know how many of you are familiar. That's what the Camp David Accord speaks about, the national rights of the Palestinian people. But part of the way the Camp David Accord passes is that wherever each side disagreed on what was agreed upon, they sent an accompanying letter. So while the Camp David Accords speak about the national rights of the Palestinian people, Begin in his letter says, I don't accept that. Now, it's one of the reasons why we haven't advanced, because once that's you see, it's a great negotiating tactic. Let's get everybody to agree on a document, and part of agreeing on a document is that we agree that even though we sign this document, we don't necessarily have to accept the document. Welcome to the Middle East. It's an interesting way of concluding conversations. It's interesting. When is it that Israelis actually, there's a Palestinian people? Can there be another people if it's my land? To this day, could it be an occupation if it's mine? Tal Becker's going to speak about that. Nowhere is this more central than in Jerusalem, which is the capital of the people of the land. I'll be speaking about that. Malila will be speaking about that on Sunday and Monday. In many ways, our path forward is going to be shaped by our ability to put forth what does it mean to be a people of the land and a people of the book at the same time. Also, one of the deep schisms or chasms between Israel and North American Jewry is that by definition, people of the land could be something that you hear. You might experience it a little bit, but it doesn't define your Jewishness the way it defines Israeli Jewishness. The third leg of the Trinity, which is transformed by 67, is God. Prior to 67, God is a problem. God's a real problem. Because why are you underachieving to that amount? Job is a theological possibility and even a coherent one. But could you really live in a Jobian reality for 2,000 years? Think about it conceptually. What does it mean to live in a Jobian experience for 2,000 years without reaching another conclusion? How long could you say, I don't understand? How long could you say, God, you have a plan that I don't understand? It's very difficult. The God who hides God's face, the God who shows God's awesomeness through self-control, was not the God that we planned on living with when we entered into this covenant. Basically, our commitment was predicated on a different God. It's the God that the Bible promised us. And it's the God that Christianity and Islam had, but we did not. History was a problem for Jews. We had to explain it. Why is it that we are still an authentic religion even though our existence seems to prove that we are completely out of God's radar screen? How is it that we could continue to exist even though history seems to prove that God has rejected us and chosen somebody else? The fact that we were able to sustain a narrative of chosenness despite history is one of the great miracles of Jewish theology and Jewish life. And we could point to 4 or 5 different things that served that end, not the least of which is chosenness and how we spoke about it. But we expended a huge amount of effort to try to live in history despite history. But history was a problem for us. What changes post-67 is that all of a sudden, history starts to reflect the presence of God in ways that we could only fantasize in the past. 1948 was a great victory, but it comes right after the Holocaust. So what am I supposed to, is it God's miracle? What's the story? Is it Auschwitz or the victory in the Negev? Like, which one? They're competing. I'm not so certain. What's remarkable about 67 is that it is the first victory that doesn't come after a tragedy. It's not merely the fact that we survive, but it is the first victory that prevents a tragedy. In 2,000 years, right there, for those of you who are old enough, I remember, if not read, we thought it was over. Literally, it was over. I remember I was in grade 3 at the time, and I sensed people were crying. It was just the frenetic energy. We were going to experience the second Holocaust. And for the first time in 2,000 years, victory was not the consequence or something that we eked out after a third of our people are killed. Great victory. It prevents that Holocaust. It was pure, unadulterated victory. And for the first time in a very, very long time, we could start being theologians of history. And by theologians of history, I don't mean the fact that we have to give a theological response to history, but that we could actually read within history signs for God's opinion, God's interests, God's commitments, God's intent. History becomes a book through which you understand God, not just Torah, history. I had to survive history in the past. Now, history is telling me something. I experienced that victory, and now I'm experiencing what it is that God wants of me. I couldn't do that in the past. What did God want of you? When you're living in a Jobian world, the only theologically coherent response is Anochi Afar Va'efer. I am but dust and ashes. That is the only way you live with God for 2,000 years. Oh, so from time to time, an individual or person could write this, or they could do some form of calculations. You know, you could have a Rabbi Akiva, and they're going to say to Rabbi Akiva, you think you got this history down? Hair is going to grow on your palm, and Bar Kochva is not the Mashiach. But you could try, so from time to time. But what Jews did is, we don't calculate. Because frankly, in a Jobian world, the only thing you could say is, I don't know. Post-67, we know. Look, we could do what Christians and Muslims have been doing for 2,000 years. We could read history almost like, is it called tarot cards? Tarot, not tarot. Like a tarot for God. Here it is. What is it that you want? Now I know. Post-67, God enters into Jewish political life. God enters into Jewish political life through our interpretation of history. And now, I could actually say with a very high degree of confidence what it is that I think that God wants. I couldn't say that in the past. Now I could make a direct correlation between success and the will of God. Failure and the will of God. And by the way, when do you know what God wants? After you're victorious, obviously. And so each time, you now have another factor, both in your own convictions and your debates with others. God. If I'm winning, God's on my side. God entering into Israeli politics is one of the most significant changes that's taking place in the last 50 years. And if you want to understand 50 years of Jewish political life in Israel, directly as a consequence of 1967, it is that shift. And it doesn't matter whether I'm Haredi or Tzioni Dati or right-wing or left-wing. God is here. General Winter, literally, the Mefaked, the commander of Givati, literally writes a letter to his soldiers and says, as you're about to fight in Gaza, God, you're part of God's army. You're part of God's army. The war in Gaza, you're part of God's army. The more you believe in God, the more our army, our political power needs to could be unleashed in ways that don't require reflection. As I wrote at the opening of my book, every year when I go to my brother-in-law's Haskara, and they tell me that he was killed al Kiddush Hashem. Really? He was killed al Kiddush Hashem. He died in the war in Lebanon. He was killed for the sanctification of God's name? Really? Why? Because he fought for Israel? Because he was brave? Why is what Israel wants the sanctification of God's name? Where do you get the chutzpah to associate everything that you yearn for with God? And what happens when you do that? I remember I was asked by the Joint Chiefs of Staff of Israel to speak to them on whether faith in God creates a more motivated soldier. And I came to speak, and I said, without doubt, faith in God creates a more motivated soldier. Motivated for what, however, is an interesting question. More motivated for sure. If you feel that you're God's army. But when victory, or when you are able to buttress your political positions with theological, not just theological evidence, but theological certainty, your ability to compromise, your ability to see others, is very often significantly limited. What happens when nationalism and theology start sleeping and lying down with each other. Shai Leibovich warned us about this 30, 40, 50 years ago. But you see it unfolding in Israeli life today. God, land, and power. Over the next 2 weeks, 10 days, these three ideas and their impact on the way we look at who we are, our relationship with each other, the relationship between Israel and world Jewry, our attitudes towards Judea and Samaria, occupation, possibilities of peace, issues of moral values, are all shaped by them. When you live in Israeli society, you see each one of them. You want to talk about moral red lines, as I will on, next Wednesday? All of a sudden, the people of the land is there. All of a sudden, how could I speak about moral red lines when someone else could say, I know what God wants? I know what God wants. I know, David, you're giving a class on putting God first. You're the only one giving that class. What happens? Whether God should be put first or second, is there a difference whether you live in Israel or live in North America? An interesting question. Interesting question. And so, welcome. Welcome to a light summer. What happens here, as you know, is that what's unique about this, as distinct from other trips to Israel, is this Beit Midrash is a very, very, very serious Beit Midrash. It doesn't mean that everything that we say is serious, but it's serious in the sense that the weight of Jewish people and the weight of Jewish history is on our shoulders. And we're living in a very, very difficult time. Maybe it's much better than other times, and that's definitely possible. But from where I and you are all sitting, we know that it is not self-evident, not merely that Miami and Manhattan aren't going to be flooded in 20 years. It's not self-evident that we're going to make it. It's not a given. None of us could sit back and say, that's a given. I'm not being a prophet of doom. But we don't have the confidence that way cannot lead to way, which cannot lead to way, which could significantly alter the conversation. And that means we have a heavy responsibility. My bracha to all of us is that we take this responsibility very, very, very seriously. And and my commitment to you is that this institute, all of our staff, and everything that you will experience here is that we are going to do everything in our power, and by that I mean everything in our power, to enable you to take your commitment seriously. Welcome. Thank you. We have a few minutes for questions, or anybody have any questions? Did you tell, by the way, the question rule? Yes. You gave that question rule? Yes. No, that was only half of the question rule. Did you tell the other half?
If you've asked one question, that's it for the day.
No, that's a soft version of one question. You've had it for the day. And you're good, because think if there's 140, 50 people here, 10 sessions, more than 2 to 3 questions in the context of a whole seminar during plenaries is probably your quota. 3 is a quota. If you're doing No, you should please take that upon yourself, because what it will do is will enable more and more people to be part of a larger conversation. Not everybody has the quickest draw. Some people ask, so so now I just saw, now you could say, 1 second, do I really want to ask my question now? Yes, please, sir. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 6, I don't know if you're not waiting. You're waving or are you asking? You're waving. Okay. Those we'll take, hi, how are you? Yes, please, sir.
Could you clarify the difference between connections to the land for the Chalutzim and connections to the land that is distinguishing after 67?
Great. For the Chalutzim, the primary place that land had was as a way of healing the distorted, unnatural diasporic reality of a people who believed that life was here and not in a body. The embracing of the land was not embracing of the land of Israel. It was the embracing of the land. And I know I'm simplifying, and of course in the religious Zionist community it existed beforehand. But by and large for the Chalutzim, it was land-based life, agriculture. It was, give me back my body. It was to heal us from the sickness of Pirkei Avot in their minds, which said, Hamahalech baderech, v'mafsik mimishnato v'omer, mayafe ilan zo mitchayev benafsho. A person who's walking along the road and stops their learning, because obviously what do you do when you're walking? You're learning, because a Jew only learns. And you stop your learning and you say, how beautiful is this tree, is deserved of death. The Zionists looked at that and they didn't do the move. Forget it, I know it's only if you think that seeing the tree is a stopping of your learning, but when you see it as an integral part of your learning, it's one and the same. I know that's very meaningful and it touches all of us deeply. But the bottom line is they say this is a sick Mishnah. It's a sick Mishnah. And it's in the Torah of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. It's a Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai approach that Judaism replaces life. For them, to be a people of the land meant to be a healthy people. Post 67, to be people of the land meant to be Jews through the land. By connecting to the land is the space through which you connect to your past. It's the way I walk with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They didn't have to. They were looking to be farmers, not to walk with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's a different experience of land. And post 67. Is that sufficient? Thank you. I think yes.
How will you characterize the influence of the Holocaust on this worldview and all of these discussions relating to an Israeli mentality today?
Yes. Did you all hear that? Yeah. How does the Holocaust influence this story? I think in many ways 1967 buries the Holocaust. 1967 is the counter-significant 20th century reality. More than 48. 48 is still deeply connected. It's an outgrowth of the Holocaust. 67 is the antidote to the Holocaust. 67 is the antidote theologically, politically. Here it is. It is in 67 that we become something completely different. And part of what happens is that when we look at the Jewish community today, there are some who remember Joseph, and there are some who don't remember Joseph. And the ones who remember Joseph are getting older and older. Those who remember the Holocaust, what does that do? And those for whom that's not the defining feature, and when they look at Israel, they don't see that. Now it's interesting. One of the fascinating phenomena is how in current Israeli politics, they're going back to the Holocaust and skipping 60. It's fascinating, this dance. How is it that now, like one way of looking at the current government is that on the one hand, we are David, we are 67 Jews who think we've been transported back to 1938. And it's being in 1938 as a 67 Jew. That's this strange reality which causes fascinating consequences. I think there was yes, yourself, just those who, the first five, I think it was yourself, please, and then I think you, yes, please, and then yourself, and then we come. Yes, please. No, that's what I responded to Amy. Prime Minister Netanyahu, I got into a lot of trouble because when I said this, he truly believes that he's in 1938 right now. But he's in 1938 as a superpower. And he now has the ability to prevent Kristallnacht and to prevent the consequences. And part of what's interesting is how one of the most powerful countries in the world could see itself as a potential Holocaust victim. It's part of the complexity of contemporary Israel today, and you're absolutely right. So 1967 buries the Holocaust conceptually, and then it starts coming back primarily from the Second Intifada and on. It starts coming back. It came back earlier when we started the trips to Poland, but then it was Israel as the antidote to it. This is what could have been. The Holocaust was Israel, this is what could have been if it wasn't for the grace of Zionism. Now, we are living with 67 power while experiencing the existential reality of being on the doorstep of Kristallnacht number 2. And that's one story. I do believe that a very large segment of North American Jewry feel that they're in a different century. And that creates sometimes some significant challenges. Yes, please, sir.
I missed the reference to Leibowitz, and I was just catching up notes here, but I'm wondering if you could elaborate a little bit.
Yes, Leibowitz.
Nationalism and theology and where morality plays in it.
I remember sitting for years with my father and Leibowitz, watching the two of them talk. And it was a great gift, because I carried my father's books. So by carrying his books, wherever he went, I went. That was sort of what I did through my teenage years. My father was unbelievably excited by the victory of 67 and by the religious potential that 67 unleashed or made possible. And Leibowitz was living with a tremendous dread of what 67 was making possible. And the two of them, my father, when he writes from defender to critic, towards the end of his life, he becomes Leibowitzian. He understood what Leibowitz was talking about. Leibowitz, you could read Leibowitz, things that Leibowitz wrote in the 50s, and it's as if they were written today. But every generation never respects their prophets. But he was through articulating, and maybe this is one of the reasons why he did so, where he wants to make the worship of God into an end unto itself and not a means. That the worship of God is the totality of the experience, and the singular focus of Jewish life is precisely not because he read the Akedah in a certain way, but because he understood the temptation of what Zionism could cause if you don't have that. That when the worship of God is a means and not an end, when the worship of God has to fit into your life and your fulfillment, then God and religion could become the servant of nationalism, and he understood more than anyone the potential of idolatry of Zionism. And he put it forth, and everybody post-67 hated him for it. And he becomes the vilified. Now, he also enjoyed that status. He enjoyed being he got joy out of it. It was like part of his personality. He had a prophetic. The prophets are all psychologically semi-unstable and love being lonely. No, you don't go into that job if you actually want to have friends. No, it's not something you do. It's like they're bizarre people. They run on the mountains naked sometimes. They're like kind of screwy. They're not the most. No, they're not the most well-adjusted people. They actually think God speaks to them. That's besides it. But besides that point. But no, it's like, and there's a Leibowitzian had this lonely. He wanted to be he was the voice. And he earlier on understood the dangers of 67. He already saw it post-48 and writes about it. And it is only in the 80s, it is only after Gush Emunim that people begin, whether it's my father or Avi Ravitsky or lots of other people, begin to start writing about what place does God have? What is this messianic politics that's going on here? What happens? When God, this is not Hatchalta de Gula anymore. This is Geula Mamash. This is the redemption, because God has come back to Jewish history. And when you feel that you're in that era, what happens? And what happens when the state is the vehicle of this messianic story? So Leibovich warned us, and he was very frightened. Again, he was frightened about the relationship between God and Torah in Israel. And 67 in all of them changes the balance and the equation. I hope yes, please, sir.
I was here in 73 studying philosophy with your father at Hebrew University. And the Yom Kippur War affected him profoundly.
Yes.
I was waiting for you to speak about the Yom Kippur War, some kind of turning point.
See, Yom Kippur War is a really interesting story when we see part of the reasons why we're not talking about 1973 is we become a deeply Kabbalistic institution. Why is that a joke? If we only deal with number sevens right now. 17, 47, I know. 17, 47, 67, 217. Like we're if it's not with a 7, if it's not about Teva and the definition of, then we just have. But other than that, it's interesting. 73, I don't have the time now. 73 could possibly be just, again, if you're a 1967 Jew, it could become the deepest reiteration of everything about 1967. Because the reality is it was an even greater victory. And the miracles and God's are even more present. And I remember in grade 10, when I was in grade 10 in yeshiva, there were a few days when we did not learn. I want to know, did anybody here ever have to stop regular life because the Mashiach was coming? I did. You couldn't have classes. Kids came to school with chauffeurs. 73 was Milchemet Gog Magog. The Mashiach was coming. Literally, school classes stopped. Like, do you know what it's like? People, it's like, it's not in theory one day, actually being in a reality where Mashiach is coming. Not, we want Mashiach now. That's a cute song. Mashiach is coming now. Not maybe, now. And literally, there was that certainty. So 73 could be the continuation and even the ultimate vindication of 67. And 73 could also be the moment where you wonder whether power is an end and whether we've aggrandized that too much as well. 73 could either fit into the paradigm or the beginning of a process. Did the first intifada in Lebanon, is that where it started, or did it begin to start in 73? It doesn't really matter. It could be both. Yehuda's here, and he's ready to start. We've started. Let's have just a great 2 weeks together. Thank you. We're color coordinated this year.
Yeah, it's the Zionist colors. So, hi everyone. When the book of great moments in work-life balance is written, then the scheduling of the drop-off of the camp bus at the same time that you're supposed to teach 150 rabbis, the exact same time, I think will be a chapter. So thank you for bearing with me. With the slight change of the schedule, he got off to camp, all is well, and I'm happy to be here. And I just want to add, before I jump us in and get us started, that it really has never stopped for me to be a huge honor and a weighty responsibility to sit at the front of this Beit Midrash with all of you, and I feel a tremendous sense of gratitude that you give of your time to make this place the Makom Torah that it becomes. So thank you. I know that Donniel walked us through what we're going to do over the next 10 days and the concept of what we're trying to do. I want to add one piece to that. This is an institute that historically has not done a lot of history. And actually, one of the things that is countercultural about this institute has been its constant present tense and future tense orientation. For me, coming to the Institute 7 years ago with a background as a historian and learning that this isn't a place that does history was very jarring. It took me a while to figure out what was going on. And there is actually something countercultural to a Jewish people that has thought so often in reference to the historical events of our past as the means of understanding our present and our future, to move into a place that thinks much more in reference to philosophical categories in the present. It took a while and a getting used to, a shift of discipline and a shift of orientation. And this year on this program, our terminology that we use to define this program is with reference to particular historical events and not particularly long ago, as Jewish history goes. When the Hartman Institute proposes to spend 10 days talking about 1917, 1947, and 1967, it is signaling a desire to play in the realm of history, to talk about the significance of historical events. And at the same time, and I get caught in this myself, the goal of this program, and I think this is probably clear, is not to spend a lot of time unpacking the historical events themselves for their own sake, nor unmaking or undoing the particular mechanics of history, because historians do both the work of preserving the narrative of what happened at a particular time and then challenging and provoking that things never quite happened as we say or we think that they happened. We're trying to do something a little bit different, which is history but not history. That is, identifying historical milestones, but still thinking with those historical milestones about their significance for our present-day politics, and more than that, often thinking about their significance for our future politics. So I want you to be thinking in those methodological terms throughout this 10-day period. When are we talking about what actually happened in 1917, and when are we talking about the larger ideas that 1917 connotes and conveys to us, and what it means to carry around the burdens and the gifts of these major historical events. It goes without saying that we are living on the tail end of perhaps the most dramatic century that our people has seen since the first century. Right? Probably between, 50 or so CE to 150 CE was a pretty momentous 100 years. Two massive revolts, huge loss of life, major exiles, major transformations, not just in the lived reality of what it meant to be a Jew in antiquity, but in the conceptual and adaptive translation from those historical events into what Judaism was going to mean, from the birth of Christianity to the birth of Rabbinic Judaism and so forth. Then you have like a long stretch of time, the middle period, and then this century, 1917 to 2017, is as momentous and consequential in terms of population dislocations and transfers, death and rebirth, and the Ashkenazi narrative of history and the Mizrahi narrative of history, both wrapped up in some ways, sometimes through the story of the State of Israel, sometimes around it and disconnected from it. And so this offers, this week offers us an opportunity to identify a series of events as essentially the punctuation marks in that dramatic history. Again, not merely to understand why they were significant, but to build what I hope becomes a little bit of the canonical version of history that we Jews do so often in our rendering of history, which we then call memory. When we take canonical moments, attach to them significance and meaning, and then use the vocabulary that's created, that language of meaning, as the means of animating our theology and our politics, that's what Jews do to history. And so this, for us, feels like not merely a foray into the past for the past 100 years, but the beginning of the excavation of a theology of politics that might be critical for the next 100. That's the low and ambitious goal of what we want to try to do over this next week and a half. The first idea I want us to play with is the idea of that central idea introduced, or at least encapsulated, by 1917. namely the idea of the Jewish people as a nation, and second of all, the juxtaposing of that story, that the Jewish people are not merely a religion but a nation, with the particular aspiration to connect to a particular homeland. So that we move from being a people who is connected to a notion of peoplehood to a people that is connected to a notion of peoplehood that attaches that peoplehood to a particular land, as something that had been obviously a big story of the Jewish past, but becomes concretized as a political program and a political position defining the rest of the 20th century. What I want to do for the next Chavruta time is I want to walk through this journey of the navigations and negotiations around the issue of peoplehood throughout the 20th century, the pushes and pulls, going back to the 19th century and its tensions, and the rise of two competing ideas that continue to characterize Jewish attitudes towards peoplehood today, and that we are somewhat stuck on in one version here in America, not here, in one version in America and in a different version here in Israel. The central tension I want to play with, if you open up your sources, and then I'm going to tell you what to do for your Chavruta. The central tension I want you to play with is it's an old Hartman Institute idea. You've studied it here before. If you were here for the summer on peoplehood, you've learned it. If you've been in RLI, you've learned it. One version of this was something that we studied for a long time and called Genesis Judaism and Exodus Judaism. The Genesis of family, the Judaism of family, the Judaism of belonging to a story that doesn't obligate you towards anything but responsibility to your family. And Exodus Judaism, which is a Judaism of aspiration and ambition, responsibility, trying to do something for the world, that maybe I'm a family, but I'm a family with a mission. Two other ways of framing that. Donniel likes the language of being, the Judaism of being and the Judaism of becoming. Right? Judaism of being obligates us merely to be Jews, right? To perpetuate other Jews, to be in familial relationship with Jews, and so forth. The Judaism of becoming is the Judaism of striving to achieve something for the world and for ourselves. The other terminology that I prefer, and you can pick your own, is horizontal and vertical. Is our responsibility essentially horizontal to other Jews, to members of our family, or is our responsibility vertical to those who came before us and those who came after us? Or put differently, if you prefer kind of theological directionality, is our responsibility to God as opposed to a responsibility merely to other people. These tensions are found in the difference between the Judaism that's expressed in the first text that you have here, famously, that for all the transgressions the whole world is punished, that iniquities fall upon other people, this thus teaching us, Milamed, famously, Shekol Yisrael Arevim Ze Bazeh, a text that we all know, which means not merely that all Jews are responsible for one another, but all Jews are effectively bondsmen for each other, that we are connected to one another through a network of responsibility. A text that connotes nothing about theology per se, but connotes much more the obligations of collective responsibility. And in contrast, I know I'm doing this quickly, but you'll have time to learn. In contrast, a vertical Judaism imagines that the responsibility of one Jew to another is not intrinsic, but emanates out of the fact that they all have a shared purpose. And as the central image to think about, the Rambam's Hilchot Tfilah describes famously that you're supposed to face the temple when you pray. What is implied? A person standing in the diaspora faces Eretz Yisrael and prays. One standing in Eretz Yisrael faces Jerusalem. One standing in Jerusalem faces the temple, one standing in the temple faces the Holy of Holies, and so forth. And what happens is everybody winds up facing the same direction. In other words, the extent to which I have a relationship to another Jew is not because I see them, but because we all see the same purpose. These are two really different images of peoplehood. One in which the notion of Jewish peoplehood is intrinsic. It is simply because I am a Jew and you are a Jew, and therefore we have responsibility to one another, versus the notion of peoplehood that emanates from the fact that all of us are heading in the same direction and seeking the same purpose. And all of these obviously have flaws. A strict peoplehood of simply being, the horizontal peoplehood, sometimes comes across as, what, I'm supposed to just love Jews because they're Jews? That's it? A strict peoplehood of facing in the same direction winds up oftentimes making us attack those who are not facing in the right direction. Right? So both of these visions of peoplehood, when taken to their absolute extremes, can be damaging. They can be narcissistic, they can be hollow. But the fact that both of these exist as canonical texts within our tradition suggests that we have been trying for a long time to navigate the tension between what we'll call network-oriented peoplehood, the peoplehood of the horizontal, and purpose-oriented peoplehood, the peoplehood of the vertical. We have tried for a long time to be a people that has said both of these stories matter, and how do we hold on and sustain them over a long period of time? The narrative I want to suggest is that the 20th century has been a game of whiplash between the horizontal and the vertical, and that we, as modern American and modern Israeli Jews, are living with the consequences of what oftentimes seems like a zero-sum game between horizontal peoplehood and vertical peoplehood. That's the story I want you to interrogate today. The last text I gave you in the opening on the horizontal and the vertical is one of those places where I think you see them both in the same text, where, with the first half of this text from the Sifra, I'm sorry it's not here in Hebrew, Ve'ahavta l'recha kamocha, Rabbi Akiva Omer ze klal gadol b'Torah. This is the fundamental principle of Torah. Usually when this text gets quoted, we stop there. That is a text about horizontal responsibility. But Ben Azai comes along and says, actually, Zeh Sefer Toldot Ha'adam, this is the story of the generations of mankind, this principle is more fundamental. This is a literal rendering of the difference between horizontal responsibility and vertical responsibility. Is my responsibility merely to other people, or is my responsibility to those who came before me and those who came after me? I want to position as our starting point the belief that the canonical story of Jewish tradition has been the dance, the relationship between who you are and what you do, the horizontal and the vertical, the being and the becoming. And again, that the 20th century, the 19th and the 20th century, has been the whiplash through that story. What you'll see in the sources is primarily, almost exclusively modern and contemporary texts. What I want you to read are the emergence in the 19th century as a response to the twin tensions of emancipation and enlightenment, and we'll go into greater detail on this, the rise of vertical identities, the belief that we are less accountable and less responsible to other Jews and much more interested in our own particular versions of vertical Judaism, both as reflected in the Pittsburgh platform and in the response of the Khatam Sofer. You can argue between yourselves which one of those texts should have come first. I want to look then at the 20th century in response to anti-Semitism and the rise of Zionism as the great horizontal pushback, the great pushback of being against becoming in the Balfour Declaration, the pivotal text of 1917, in one small section of the League of Nations mandate. If you're on page 3, it's just the second and third paragraph, the second and third whereases. You can focus on that. And very tellingly, in the Columbus platform of 1937, which is the reform movement pushing back against its own Pittsburgh platform. So the tensions of the horizontal and the vertical are not these types of Jews are struggling with this tension and these types of Jews are on the other side, but inside all of our communities is a wrestling and a yanking back and forth between a story of becoming and a story of being. I want you to notice in the middle of the 20th century a series of thinkers who tried to resist what they perceive as being the flattening of Judaism to simply being about the peoplehood of the horizontal. In the language of Rosenzweig, you'll see in the middle of Rosenzweig, when he starts talking about, read the second really and third paragraphs, maybe the fourth, from what then holds us or held us together since the dawn of emancipation until Zionism fails us. Spoiler alert. Not a big fan. You can see in Edwin Montague's response to the Balfour Declaration just prior. I want you to look in the Arendt text on page 9 and 10 of the source book, just the bottom paragraph where she says, to come to the point. It's very useful when people say that because then you know when to actually start reading. Read when she says to come to the point until the end of the next paragraph. I don't love the Jews, nor do I believe in them. I merely belong to them. And Deutscher as well. And this will give you a sense of the stakes of the debate in the middle of the 20th century, all of these guys are losing. Montague, Rosenzweig, Arendt, and Deutscher are losing mid-20th century in the rise of Zionism and the horizontalization of peoplehood. And then I want you to look at the result of this in the 20th century, the American articulation of this problem in Stephen Cohen and Jack Wertheimer's Whatever Happened to the Jewish People, and the Israeli articulation of this problem, for which we'll give Achad Ha'am the credit for prophetically anticipating what would happen here in the State of Israel, which you can scan through just the first 3 or 4 paragraphs. I know there's a lot here. We have some time. It's very hot outside, so I would recommend, it's pretty hot in here, but you can stay in here. You can also use the rooms, I think, on the side here in the Beit Midrash. You can also find other places throughout the Machon that are a little bit cooler. And when we come back together, we will both plow through this 20th century story, and most importantly, we'll start to consider, last sentence, we'll start to consider the ramifications of being the 21st century inheritors of this tension that is oftentimes pulling us apart. I think we start again at 4:30.